Thank you very much. I do apologize for being so strict with time. Now we're going to move smoothly to the panelists responding to the friction created on the stage. And I will just introduce the rules because we really have to be strict on time. We want the audience to be involved, asking questions, making comments. So I have to be strict, so please don't get upset with me. In the order, first it would be Calum Nicholson, after that Anthony O'Hare, and then Frank Furedi. It's going to be 5 minutes each. Then depending how well, please don't distract me. Then depending on how well organized you are with time, then we might see whether we could have a quick exchange on stage or whether we're going to open up to the audience straight away. So please do be strict with time. Thank you. It's up to you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. So just very quickly, just to say, obviously you commented on my comments, and just to say that my point is not really about the science per se. It's saying, well, the truth is with most of us are not scientists. And even scientists in certain areas may not know about other areas of science. And my point is simply that even if you, for the sake of argument, accept the science, there are still so many questions that we can all still engage in as engaged citizens, is simply my point. But I just want to talk very quickly, and I'll talk quickly about something with climate change. I mentioned before that we care about it because of its presumed social impact. I want to give a very quick example about the difficulty of talking about causality. And I want to give an example that's nothing to do with climate change, but you'll hopefully see the point. In 1970, a very heavy earthquake hit Peru. It was 7.7 on the Richter scale, killed about 70,000 people, flattened 200,000 buildings, left 500,000 homeless. And to this day, I think it's still actually the most devastating disaster that's hit the Western Hemisphere. Now, about 20 years after that, an anthropologist called Anthony Oliver Smith wrote a paper on it, calling it Peru's 500-year earthquake. Now, he didn't say it's a 500-year earthquake because it took it happens every 500 years, or because it would take 500 years to rebuild. He said 500-year earthquake because he said it took 500 years for the conditions to be put in place by which it led to such a disaster. What happened 500 years ago? Well, obviously Spanish colonialism. Now, the Andean peoples had been there about 10,000 years. They knew it was an earthquake zone, and they had various adaptations. They didn't cement or fix together the walls. They tied them together so they could move freely in an earthquake. They didn't tile the roofs, they thatched them. They had warehouses full of grain so that if there was a disaster, they could feed people in an emergency. And they did not build a city at Arequipa, which was the earthquake epicenter. And then the Spaniards showed up, and they built in the Spanish style with fixed together walls with tiled roofs. They took the warehouses of grain as tax, and they built and then rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt a city at Arequipa on the river in a fertile area, which was knocked down by earthquakes in the 18th century alone 4 times. So by 1970, what you had were 3 factors come together to create the conditions for this massive disaster. You had a very heavy earthquake, 7.7 on the Richter scale. You had a much larger population due to 20th century population growth. And you had 500 years of poorly adapted culture. And so this is what led to the disaster. There's a lesson in this, which I think is very interesting, which applies, I think, equally to climate change, and I'll come back to that very quickly. That the lesson is that, and it's a lesson that is known to scholars of disaster risk reduction. And they have a phrase for this, which is quite provocative. They say there's no such thing as a natural disaster. They say there are natural hazards. But they also say earthquakes don't kill people. What kills people is collapsing buildings. And it's an important distinction. And that's the entire of disaster risk reduction's scholarships. It's like that axiomatic statement. Earthquakes don't kill people, collapsing buildings kill people. The point is the conditions of the disaster is social, political, economic, historical. It's not the natural phenomena per se. Now, how is that relevant to climate change, just to wrap up my comments? An earthquake is interesting because you can identify it in space and time, if we're unlucky, here, now, for 45 seconds. But climate change, by definition, is not something you can identify here and now. It's a statistical artifact. What climate change refers to is, first of all, a global average, but also a 30-year rolling average. As you all know, you can't simply look at the weather and say, it's a bad summer, or it's a good summer, it must be climate change. It's about the average over time. The reason why that's relevant for policymaking and us is that you and I, we don't exist at a 30-year rolling average or globally. We always exist somewhere at some time. And that's where actually our lives exist, and that's where our policies must engage. So the problem with talking about climate change sometimes, and presuming it can be a guide to what we do about it, is that it leaves out the different levels of analysis. Climate is I would argue, we may disagree on this, but the science, but is almost academic whether we agree or not. If you take for the sake of argument that the science is valid, factually valid, the point is it's a level of abstraction that's not the level at which we live our lives. They're simply apples and oranges in how we actually relate them. And the final comment I'll make on this is that, I don't know how much time I got actually, Aggie, a minute? Okay, all right.
No more.
I had a very elaborate and witty analogy, but I'll leave it out. So the point I'm making is there's a distinction between science and scientism. Science is a useful tool. Science is just a crude shorthand for a collection of methods we have that have proved pretty successful, essentially. Scientism is where we believe science can also be a guide to our culture and our values. And that's the difference between saying science is more like a hammer or a saw that you use to build a house. But actually, we want to live in a home. The tools will help you build the house, they won't help you make a home. And so the science can help us understand the climate, but in understanding society, that's like the home analogy, right? It's more about values and culture and so on. So my point is simply to say, when we think about questions beyond the consensus, just to be conscious that the science is important, but once even assuming we can even find a consensus on the science, assuming that, just for the sake of argument, all the interesting questions remain untouched, and in fact, probably the most difficult questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like first to thank Richard Lindzen for a very thoughtful and illuminating talk. My comment about all of this is I loathe the expression "the science," which politicians and others, activists, all kinds of people hide behind all the time. And I just want to refer to a little bit of philosophy of science in which I was brought up many years ago. Now, there was a famous dispute in 1965, 60 years ago, between Karl Popper and his former pupil, Thomas Kuhn, about whether there is such a thing as normal science. Now, Kuhn had written this book, which has had immense influence, not just in philosophy, but in the humanities as well, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which he maintained that science always operates under a paradigm, a body of theory, which isn't questioned. And he called this normal science. Now, Karl Popper did not disagree with Kuhn that the term normal science did, in fact, often describe how science operated. That is, everybody agreeing to one general approach and just working within that, not questioning it. But Popper said, perhaps exaggerating slightly, that if normal science was the norm, it was a danger to civilization, which might have been seem slightly hyperbolic, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps we are seeing that now, because according to Popper, who knew a lot more about the history of science perhaps than Kuhn did in a way, science operates through competition, criticism, falsification. And for Popper, there could be no ultimate proof of anything in science for reasons I won't go into, but we can discuss that later. We can't know, Popper said, we can only guess. And that is the proper, to his mind, scientific approach. And always his big stock example was that the most successful theory of science ever produced, and it was a wonderful theory by a wonderful scientist, was of course Newton's theory, which was unquestioned pretty well well, with some, all this can be slightly qualified, but it was more or less unquestioned for 200 years until Einstein and people who followed Einstein showed that it was wrong. Don't say no, it was wrong. And this is the problem, that people who talk about the science think that even if there is a consensus in science, the consensus is right. Now, applying this to climate science, I think I have read the IPCC reports, and I notice that they say that within however many years it is, there will be a degree of warming between 1.5 degrees and 4.5 degrees. Now, this, to my mind, is not a prediction. It's a difference of 300%. When Newton said that, or his science said that Uranus would be at a certain point, he didn't say within a 300% difference. He said it would be there. And that's what, following that up, was what actually led people to discover Neptune. So my first point is that climate science, we can question so-called science because it is based on computer modeling that leads to all kinds of different predictions, even in the official reports, which are wildly different. Second point, which touches on some of the points that Richard made, scientists are wonderful people, but they're not good at political decision-making. And they should not be given a kind of alibi by politicians for the politicians not making their own decisions but referring to the science. Very little cost-benefit analysis is done on attempting to get to net zero and so on. We could also say, and this is another Popperian point, that we don't know the future. And one of the reasons we don't know the future and cannot know the future, is because the future is influenced by advances in technology, or changes in technology. It might not always be advances, but influenced by changes in technology. Now, we can't predict changes of technology, because if we knew them now, we could do them now, but we can't. I mean, after all, did Alan Turing ever predict the rise of the internet? I don't think so. But it was on his theorizing that computers and so on were built. We can't know the future, and even though we can't know the future, there is no such thing as a scientific consensus, or there shouldn't be. There is no such thing as the science. As Richard Lindzen has pointed out, politicians and activists are prepared to do the old Leninist trick of impoverishing and oppressing people now for the benefit of a future neither they nor anyone else know about. And that strikes me as pure arrogance.
Thank you. Frank Furedi.
So this is the first MCC Brussels discussion where I disagree a little bit with my fellow panelists. I think that there's a danger of doing what the environmental zealots do, which is to ascribe almost like a genealogical, conspiratorial sort of set of motives as to what they are doing. Somehow the march to the university, but this time in relation to the environment. And it is a case of reading history backwards, where all of a sudden the environmentalists of today are the inevitable theological consequence of a frustrated left that has lost its way in the late 1960s, 70s. I'm one of the few people, perhaps other than Richard, that's old enough to remember Earth Day. I remember very, very clearly because a few weeks before Earth Day, all the demonstrations were about Vietnam and social and economic issues. And suddenly you could see that the left, particularly in North America, lost belief in its ideological conception, and people who were red on Monday became green on Tuesday. It was almost like a kind of natural mutation that seemed to occur. But all this was done, I think, in the context of a much more moral crisis which the West faced. It was particularly summed up by Jimmy Carter's loss of confidence speech, when he actually talked about how America has lost confidence in itself. This is in the aftermath of the oil crisis. But the interesting thing was that within like 10, 12, 13 years, all of a sudden, all these ideas that had bare existence, was on the margins of society, suddenly enveloped culture, Western culture, particularly American culture, but then gradually, because of the power of California ideas, it dominated the rest of the world. And I think what's very interesting, that when you actually, as a sociologist, I scratch the surface of the phenomena we're discussing, what we're really seeing, is a loss of belief in humanity, because essentially humanity becomes accomplice to all these horrible and bad things that occur in the environment. So I think that's what's really going on here, rather than any kind of political project that evolves and develops. I slightly disagree with Richard on that. I think that if you understand my theory about the nature of the dehumanization of public life, you can also understand why Colin is a little bit wrong. If you look at the Peruvian example of Oliver, what Oliver is arguing is exactly the same thing as what the environmentalists argue, which is that the reason why so many people died in Peru is because of the human impact. Right? It was the human impact that caused this by building in the wrong way. By the way, the same arguments were raised in the Lisbon earthquake in a very important debate between Rousseau and Voltaire and all these other people. And that's when they basically argued, they began to develop the conception that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Right? Well, if there's no such thing as a natural disaster, then every disaster is man-made. And we become complicit in the destruction of the planet. And this was an argument that existed in embryonic form in the 60s and the 70s, but then gradually today it gets to the point at which we even believe that if you have more babies, the more children you have, the greater the impact in terms of its carbon consumption, the worse it gets. So what you really end up with is a very misanthropic shift that occurs within society. And that's the tragedy, because it's become so powerful now that people don't even recognize what they're saying. They don't even recognize anymore that, whenever they blame human beings for a variety of problems, what they've done is they naturalized issues that throughout most of modern times, certainly since the Enlightenment, were seen as social problems or economic problems or cultural problems. They do become naturalized and become problems of nature, to which we essentially have to have solutions that deal with these things in that kind of particular way. I would like us to sort of stop and think for a moment and just reflect on the term human impact. Human impact. But now when you look at human history, we tend to think of human impact as a really positive way in which humanity socialized nature. And I know that today it's a bad thing to talk about the importance of controlling nature, but that is a really positive thing that humanity has done through science, taking control over nature. But now, when we use the term human impact, it's got a negative connotation. It's got an entirely negative connotations. So what does that say about ourselves? Right? If the impact that we make on the environment is ipso facto negative, what we are really doing, in a sense, is something that is entirely corrosive and destructive of the whole project of which we humans have really essentially signed up to. I think that the very language, as a sociologist, what I find is that the very language that has emerged in this kind of misanthropic vocabulary is something that we need to challenge and struggle against. I mean, just take the word skepticism. Today, skepticism is used as a kind of cultural crime. Skeptical people are seen as ipso facto malevolent, as corrosive. We forget the fact that historically, the skeptic was an honorable status. That skeptic meant that you didn't just jump into the sea and without challenges, checking out how deep it was. A skeptic didn't just make hasty judgment. Skepticism was above all about prejudgment, a suspension of judgment, because you wanted to find out the evidence and weigh up the evidence before you made those kinds of decisions. Today, skepticism and the skeptic, whether it's Eurosceptic or climate skeptic or any kind of skeptic, are seen as somehow horrific people rather than people that we should take seriously and honor, because they're the ones that are, in the end, playing an important role in reflecting and thinking about the issues that kind of concern us and should concern us. And when we get to policy making, which is an issue for anybody that lives within the European Union, when we think about policy making, it's precisely when we think about policy that skepticism is really called for. Skepticism doesn't mean that we reject every single policy that's put on the statute books. Skepticism would suggest and argue that if you believe that this is the way you're going to get to a particular objective, a climate objective, well, why don't you try that out in one part of Europe? Why don't you get sort of some people to test it out, to have an experiment to see whether these policies actually work, instead of uncritically imposing it on the whole of Europe? Because the minute we uncritically impose the consensus upon European societies, we end up being complicit in the kind of policies that have led to disasters in many, many parts of the world in the past. So I would imagine that what's really called for is a more liberal, in the classical liberal sense of the word, a tolerant orientation towards policy making, instead of the dogmatic imposition that seems to have become systematic within our world in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like the audience to start preparing their questions and comments. And to give you a little bit of time, I thought I will ask a question myself. And I would like to address all of the panelists and the keynote speaker, Professor. So as a member of the public, as a citizen of European Union and Poland and Britain, how can I approach this subject and ask questions without being accused of being a climate change denier or just someone that is causing trouble, but actually asking questions that would provoke an open discussion and questioning of the policies, especially because what seems now is that since we apparently have the consensus, the policies are being introduced, steamrolling all of us, and it's very hard to even enter this conversation because it's all in action already. So who would like to be first to comment?
Well, I mean, I could say something on that. I mean, I do think part of the point of a conference like this is precisely to demonstrate that there's a range of questions that I think are open to most of us, even if you don't have a PhD in climate science. There is a tendency these days for knowledge to be so specialized that we have to take things on authority. But there are often some quite simple questions we can ask. And I mean, I think one thing that's worth remembering is that we live in a world dominated by a lot of jargon. And one bit of jargon I think that is in circulation now is the concept of climate adaptation. It's jargon, it's a technocratic jargon, because there's an old word for adaptation, which is culture. There's a reason why the Swiss have different roofs from the Croatians. There's reasons why we dress differently in winter to summer and so on. So there's a reason why I didn't bring a jacket with me to Brussels, because I was in Budapest, which was rather hot this week. So culture is the old word for it, and there's a lot of, often, it's very interesting that we now believe we need to have people with degrees in climate adaptation, as if we've just invented this idea. But that's what we were doing throughout the course of human history. We forget this, and just to speak a bit to Frank's comment before on my comments, that we kind of forget that the world is hazardous. The world is trying to eat us. If you strip away all of the culture that we live with, all the clothing and the buildings and everything else, if you strip all of this away, we'd all be dead within 72 hours just from exposure. That's just so we don't notice this because we are so well adapted, because we are the beneficiaries of not just years or decades or centuries, but millennia of adaptive best practice from our ancestors to get us to where we are today. And when you strip all that away, the world is not necessarily our friend. And the point I was making about the disaster, the earthquake, is simply to say that that it's all about how our culture is organized to respond to the situation we're in. And often when you see cultures that are maladapted, there are reasons for that, which are cultural and they are historical and so on. And so I think that so when my only point would be about opening up debate is that don't be intimidated by the jargon we hear, because if you look at the jargon, like adaptation, think, well, what would we have called that before the technocrats took over the language? Probably would have just been culture. That's just one thought.
Thank you. Any questions coming from the audience already? Because I've seen some hands raising early on. So do we have microphones ready? Let's give some time for the microphones to get in the... Oh, okay. So before we get the question from the audience, Anthony would like to add.
Richard wants to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to first say, with respect to Frank, I'm not sure it is politics versus culture or anything else. Nihilism has been very much the politics of modern revolutionaries. It's not as though there is anything more to it. This would not be a very popular position, but what has happened in the US, where suddenly one day every department has a commissar for DEI, has been building for a long time. And it has not been designed to gain power, it's just destructive. So I'm not sure we differ on that so much.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say something, which is, if you look at the 60s radicals, for better or worse, they had a future-oriented orientation.
Well,
they had a strong sense of social ideas, social change, which they explicitly pronounced. Whereas today, what I find is really sad and tragic is the environmentalist movement gives up on the future. It sees the future as in a dystopic kind of a way in all of its projection. And secondly, it's got an entirely, sort of, I would say, kind of technocratic orientation towards solving the problem of society. So I think there's a huge difference between those movements.
well, there is and there isn't. I mean, a man called Weitzman at Harvard, an economist now dead, gave a certain impetus to the environmental movement when he said an existential threat gets rid of cost-benefit analysis. That fundamentally you get the right to do anything if existence is an issue. And so he pushed existence as the issue. This is not a normal political process.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. I mean, that's exactly what's happened. And I think that what I would say is that, mind you, it'd probably be very hard to argue with some of these people who will just shout you down.
Yeah.
But the science is far more uncertain than it's made out. Even
It's
if you
actually
read...
more certain than you think. In other words, if you go to the IPCC, they're never talking about an existential threat in the science section.
No, that's right. And I think we should also emphasize that there are all kinds of mitigations that can be made to deal with these problems. They're not existential threats, it's a problem. I mean, they always bang on about water levels rising. Well, I say to those people, how do you think Holland came into existence? It came into existence by a crowd of monks with picks and shovels building canals and dikes. Can't we do better than the Dutch?
But can I just say about existential issues, which is why I think it's cultural. Every domain of human experience interpret this problem in existential terms. So if you look at, for example, the whole development of therapeutic culture in the West, the way in which in universities, they basically take medical, psychological problems that people have, but if you look at the language that they write us in, it becomes almost like our existence is called into question. When you take COVID, you don't just say COVID is an epidemic, we had medical problems, public health problems. It becomes immediately an existential problem. When you look at global terrorism, we don't say global terrorism is a political issue, a military threat perhaps. No, it's an existential problem. So, I mean, I've counted the number of times existential issue or problems are linked or coupled to the most trivial of matters. And I think that way of thinking has really permeated American society in particular, but also Western Europe now. And I think that's quite independent of whatever any group of activists or whatever individual says or does, because it is the zeitgeist. It's the zeitgeist that shapes the way we live our lives.
But isn't that the standard technique of totalitarianism? Promote fear, promote...
Let's see if the public is afraid. Let's give them a chance to speak, ask questions and comments. So there's been a lady on the left-hand side in the third row, and then the gentleman in front of her. So that's first, and then I will look to the right-hand side and to young people.
I'm young. I don't.
No, the lady first, and then the gentleman in the second. Yeah.
Thank you. As an anthropologist, the only thing I know is that the history of human being is clearly linked to the climate, and that without a very strong glaciation period, we wouldn't be here, and Homo habilis wouldn't have been on Earth. So I think the history of human being is just struggling with these kind of conditions on the long term, on a daily basis, basic also. So. And when you see also the time lapse of the Alps, for instance, you see the climate change. It has been only changing. So, and it's really strange because sometimes you see ecological programs saying, at this time, this being was in a water or whatever. It means that it has changed, that there were seas where now we have mountains, and it's unbelievable how it is possible to forget this very simple reality that we can see every day when we walk in the nature.
Thank you. So there's a gentleman in the second row on the left, and then a young gentleman here on the right in the second row. Yeah. Philip, yes, here, yeah. The second row from the stage, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and congratulations to all these panelists. In some of the countries, to be ecological activist is more dangerous than being drug dealer. And there are countries, for the last 3 times, COP conferences were held in the countries which are not known for democratic standards. COP27 was in Egypt, 28 in United Arab Emirates, and COP29 will be in Azerbaijan, where people are arrested for slight criticizing the regime. One of these recently was Professor of London School of Economics, Gubade Badoglu, who was one of the key researchers and one of the critics of ecological issues. And regimes like this very often use climate conferences for blanchissement of their image when there are human rights problems and everything, but they held these conferences and they become popular, leaders come, presidents come, and they are good guys. How to avoid that dictatorial regimes take lead in climate issues? So that all three are not very, very good countries in terms of And my question is that we see that there is, very often very strong position of the scientists on certain issues, on climate issues, but politicians not often listen to the scientific positions. Is there any platform where position of the scientific community can be better heard by the politicians? Because mostly politicians are driven by economic interests, by any other interests, but to less extent on their actions are motivated by the scientific findings. Thank you very much.
Just a question from the young gentleman.
Excuse me. If there are questions addressed to the panel, why let them load up until we can no longer remember what anyone asked?
I will remind you, don't you worry. I'm here to, to do the show. Don't worry. The last question from that round.
Thank you very much. So my question is about that. What is your opinion on the role of media in reinforcing this anthropocentric approach towards the environment, and how might this impact public opinion and behavior on the level of different generations? Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for the comment from at the start. And I was actually wondering if, Calum, you can answer about the regimes whitewashing the image, because I'm aware you've been to some of these conferences and also to some of these regimes.
Yeah, I just say very quickly, well, first off, I went to COP28, and I have to say, COP and Dubai deserve each other, because I think only late-stage capitalism could have produced either. COP28 was completely surrounded by oil refineries. It was the most extraordinary thing. Just very quickly, two comments, though. On the comment about things have always changed from the anthropologist, it's interesting. I think sometimes we live in a strange age, because really, if you live in the West since World War II, we've lived in quite a stable world where we could even conceive of the concept of forecasting, because all the extra societal factors were somewhat neutral. The environment, pandemics, wars, it was pretty stable. That's the exception in human history. For most of human history, no one would have been foolish enough to think they could forecast the future. And I think what we're going back to now is the norm where we can't. So I wonder, is the problem that we can't forecast, or is it the slight conceit, the hubris that we ever could? And I think that's what's changed the last couple of years. And finally, where the gentleman said about, I think it was about the status of governments, how do we encourage governments to follow the science? I think actually sometimes the problem is the opposite. I think the governments maybe have too much deference to, or see only the science. I mean this in the sense that the science is fine, but if you look at COVID as an example, all the government said, we are following the science, which presumed that all the interesting questions were scientific ones. But the question, as put by, say, Jonathan Sumption, is there more to life than the avoidance of death, is not strictly a scientific question, it's one of culture and values. So I think to some extent, there wasn't enough room given to people who were not scientists, economists, anthropologists, philosophers. Where were the philosophers in the pandemic talking about the ethics of things? It was a very reductive, technocratic, scientific, or not even scientific, but a scientistic view of science that governments took. So I think there's a difference between respect for science and deference to science. And what I saw was too much deference rather than not enough respect.
Yeah, I would prefer that people didn't speak about the scientific community, even when they agree with me. That's the whole idea I'm trying to break down, and Karl Popper fought his whole life against this kind of way of looking at it. But I will say this, Kuhn actually is, unfortunately, right on climate change, that within the scientific community, that is within scientific institutions, there does seem to be groupthink, and this is enforced by peer review, promotion, and all the things that Kuhn talks about, and dissenters are more or less crowded out. And I think there's a problem there too. So first of all, don't talk about the scientific community, but there is a problem with the scientific community, as Richard pointed out. And also, we should try to educate politicians to think that they can't hide behind science when they have to make ethical decisions about such things as COVID and climate, both of which, by the way, are all based on rather questionable climate modelling.
Yeah. The anthropologist, did I understand what you're saying? That we've been dealing with this forever, and so it's not anomalous. People live in the Arctic. People live on the equator. We've been able to manage radically different situations, and that's often forgotten because when you talk about 1.5 degrees being the change, you're not exactly describing the Arctic versus the tropics. This gentleman here, I think, gives too much credit to science. I think it isn't the politicians paying attention to the science, it's the politicians telling the scientists what the science is. And since they support it, that was Eisenhower's, farewell address, that there was the government scientific complex that could be dangerous. And it's very much being played out now. I mean, if you're a young scientist in America or here, and you don't get published and you don't get grants, you don't get fired, you don't get promoted. And the government determines that. When the government has no interest in the science, it works well. When the government has a position, it doesn't work at all.
Thank you. Frank, would you like to address any of the comments or questions?
Well, I think just going back to the science question, you see, I actually wish that scientists, climate scientists and others would spend a little bit more time in the laboratory and spend less time making moral and political pronouncements. Because I think the issue at stake at the moment is what is the appropriate division of labor between scientists, doing hard science in particular, and people involved in the domain of policy making and politics. And what I really worry about is that what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years is the moralization of science, where scientific insights, so-called insights and scientific discoveries are given moral connotations, which basically means that they cease to have necessarily rigid and strong empirically based, factually based roots within real science. And what's really happened now is that because of the crisis of authority, moral authority in Western societies, everybody defers to the science. So there used to be a time when a politician would say in Britain that this policy is bad or good. They would use moral categories to say about the policy. Now, politicians don't say this is good and this is bad. They basically say, this is based on evidence. This is research-led policy. I mean, every time I hear the word research-led policy, I kind of reach for my metaphorical gun, because you know exactly what it's really all about. And when you look at the language of politics at the moment, it's all about evidence-based policies, research-based policies. It's a complete refusal on the part of politicians to make policy making, not by continually looking at the experts, but on the basis of what they think people would really like to see get done. And I think that's the tragedy in the way in which scientism, as been discussed earlier on, has encroached upon domains that are inappropriate for that.
Could I ask a question of you two? Could you please interpret the following incident? In the third IPCC assessment, the iconic statement, they reduce everything to one little statement at the end, was that they were now pretty confident that most of the warming since 1960 is due to man, okay? And that was blasted. And Senators Lieberman and McCain, bipartisan in the US Senate, responded in saying, this is the smoking gun, we must do something. And yet the statement itself, its most obvious interpretation was, there's no problem.
Well, I mean, one thing worth noting about the IPCC is that the actual science that makes it up is by all accounts, you know, and you may disagree, but from what I'm not a scientist, a hard scientist, but I've heard from people I know and trust that said it's fine. There's a few typos here and there, but they said
No, it's not fine.
Well, there's a second part to my sentence.
Yeah.
So the second part is that the science, this guy would say, is fine. He said the problem is the executive summaries, which are inherently much more political, and they're making these more normative statements. So I think there needs to be a pinch of salt around the framing of the issues.
Well,
I
I mean,
think
the
that's
IPC is
not
based.
true.
The role of the IPC is to make normative statements. I mean, they're not in the business of people in white coats messing around in a laboratory. I think very often they already worked on the press release before holding the conference. They already got the press release sorted before they went into their lab. And I think that for politicians, these press releases is the bread and butter on which they make, you know, I can see a smoking gun here kind of statement. So, you know, in many ways what you're describing here is the way in which the politicization of science has usurped legitimate ways in which science
But remember,
works.
the first statement was designed to be misinterpreted intentionally.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would like to know what pretty confident means.
Oh, well, they said, you know, how should I put it? I could describe how it was done, and you'll see.
Yeah, I mean,
it was
Newton
done
didn't
on
say he was
Shall
pretty
we go back to
confident.
the public,
that-
because I can see hands
But
raised.
they said, you know, something to that effect.
No, you're right. They did say that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so there's a question from Bill, please. And then we move on to the rest of the public. There's a gentleman at the front, and then here. So first, Bill.
It's more a statement, really. I'm Professor Bill Derodi. I'm a visiting professor to MCC Brussels. I think what we have to understand is that environmental activists pose, and it is a pose, as the little people. They pose as if the world is against them. And that's the premise upon which a considerable amount of sympathy from the broader public comes about. They pretend that they are fighting against big business. As we heard from Richard, big business actually folds and concedes the case quite willingly. And they pretend that they're making use of science. The reality is, and again, I think Richard made a very strong point, that they are ultimately cajoling the public, who they view as ignorant and dangerous. They're abusing what passes for evidence. But more importantly, and this is my question, they are entirely dependent, as far as I can tell today, upon the law. I mean, you look at any EU environmental debate, it's always going to be something that ends up in the European Court of Justice. And of course, lawyers are not suited to making decisions on these things. They're also a profoundly undemocratic body. But I'm curious to find out, not now, but when you come back, what the panelists think about the entire dependence of the environmental movement on state institutions, particularly the law.
Right, the gentleman here at the front, please.
Yes, allow me a little humoristic remark. Consensus in French is le consensus. And if you have the word con, you have the word foolish. So consensus is a contradiction in terminus, isn't it?
Thank you. Just one more question.
Yeah, I'd like to insist on one thing that's already been said by Professor Lindzen. The politicians don't know the science. They refer to something they believe to be the science, but just isn't. What they think is science are the words from green advocates. As Professor Lindzen say, you can read through the scientific report, as I have and you have, and you don't see a catastrophe. That's not there's no catastrophe in the science. There's only catastrophes in what the public and the politicians and the green advocates profess. Politicians don't follow the science. They ignore it. They just ignore it.
I should say something about the
you.
IPCC, just to get it straight. The instructions we were given on it were to just restrict ourselves to anthropogenic climate change. So there was no discussion about natural. And the second was to go easy on criticizing the models. Within that context, people tried not to say anything overtly wrong, but there was no attempt to objectively describe the situation. So when you read it, you don't see any real gaffes as a rule. You'll see one chapter, which is the iconic one, but otherwise people will avoid saying anything embarrassing. But it is not meant to be an exposure of how things work or how we think they work.
Any comments to Professor Durodi's comment on the institutions and the activists and politicians working hand in hand, stopping the debate?
Well, just one comment. I know the second panel actually will be, and I know Johan Gardeba is here, and we were actually talking about a similar issue yesterday, so probably it'll be addressed, I imagine, quite thoroughly in the second panel.
Okay, great, thank you. So let's move to the my right-hand side. So here we have a question in the first row.
Thank you very much, Reginald de Potesta. Can we give a name to all this? Is it a global coup? Is it global governance at the end? And New World Order? And nothing about science but control.
Thank you. Now in the third row here.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment and a question also about the social engineering part. When I lived in Berlin, I saw big posters about a mother holding children, and under the title said that climate safety, future or the murder of the climate. And this was about to having children is against the climate, and I think this is one of the worst part if we're talking about this whole climate change thing, because some of the political forces using it as a tool to social engineering. And my question is about what do you think about the ESGs, because I think those are really hidden methods to influence the European economic and social system.
Thank you. And in the fourth row, yeah?
You talked a lot about the history of climate change, etc. But I want to talk about the current state of affair of the discussion in universities and how that evolves also in the future. But because climate change is not only affecting the climate change department or the climate department of universities, but are affecting almost all parts of university. So, and there are also other issues going through our institutions, not only in universities, that are very worrying lately. So, what do you think about it?
So, Calum, you would like to come back on?
Yeah, I have a comment actually on your question and yours actually that may link together. You say, is it a global coup? And so my background's in anthropology, and something I think is very interesting are millenarian movements. And a millenarian movement was one where people believe the world is in sin, we must confront the oppression, the sin, and establish a utopia. And it's happened throughout history, particularly in Christian contexts, where people think the end of the world is coming and they have a millenarian movement emerge. I find it quite interesting right now across the West. We have a number of movements structured like millenarian ones. The social justice movements say there is a form of oppression and we must confront it and establish the utopia. Actually, arguably the QAnon movements like this, saying there was, I think, I don't know what they believe, that the lizard people are controlling people or something, but we must confront it and establish the utopia. But actually the climate movement, and this is not a comment on the validity of the science at all, but at a cultural level, the way it's swept up the whole culture, including the universities and different departments and so on, has a very millenarian feel to it. And I think it's worth pulling back and reflecting on, and I won't go into details here, but it's interesting to reflect on what millenarian movements have tended to tell us about the broader societies that are subject to them at the time. And basically, the shorthand of that is that throughout history, when societies are in a period of flux, and in my view, when communications technology has changed, and when that happens, it changes how we relate to each other, like when the printing press led to the Reformation, or the internet, the period we're in now, or the axial age with the invention of writing, whatever it is, when there have been these sort of periods of flux and change of how we communicate, we almost have to relearn how to relate to one another. And during that, you tend to have these sorts of millenarian movements emerge, it seems. So at a broader cultural level, it's quite interesting. Not the science as much, but the way that we are reacting and the way we are, the status we're giving the science in society. Again, the scientism of this project, or this concept, not the science, but the scientism, almost the religious fervor around it, is interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank.
Well, I don't think there is any religious fervor left anymore. I mean, I think it's been exhausted over it's become totally routinized, totally institutionalized, and even using the word movement is inappropriate because it's principally a movement from above. Now, within that, there are small groups like Extinction Rebellion, here and there, but by and large, what I find really quite fascinating is that if you look at the hierarchy within our society, the more you're on top, the more likely to have signed up to this outlook. And not only, I remember, I never forget that moment in my life. I've just been in Amsterdam. I did a debate at De Bali, which is like a debating society. And I step out of De Bali, and there is an advertisement for a bank, a Dutch bank, that basically says, "We are a sustainable bank." I just said, when these guys, in the business of hustling us and making money, are using the word sustainable as a way of selling their wares, something very important has changed. And I think there's a danger. I mean, the one point I really want to insist on is that if this was a movement that, the very fact that there's no name to it gives the whole game away. The reason why there's no name for it, around for it, because there really isn't that kind of social cultural impulse that leads to the generation of a form of self-definition that used to characterize movements in the past. But I think what's really behind your question, because you use words like globalist and everything else, there's an assumption that there is more than meets the eye, right? And the idea there is more than meets the eye is what unites the environmentalist movement, who thinks that people like me who question things are financed by the Koch brothers or some kind of, sorry? Whoever it is, that somehow I'm part of something, some kind of conspiracy. There's more than meets the eye, because behind people, like me, are these interests who are manipulating you like a puppet. And similarly, I think the critics of the environmental movement do the same. And I think that it is an impoverished discourse that has emerged around this whole thing. It's precisely what we need to fight against, because if we have to run on the basis of good faith. I have to accept that this person who I think is a bit of a schmuck on the other side is actually well-meaning and is genuine in terms of what they're saying. You have to assume good faith that they really mean what they say. Similarly, I hope they give me the same kind of respect and know that when I say something, I really genuinely believe in what I'm doing. And until we get to that point, we're going to have a lot of misunderstanding about what's really happening here.
Now we're going to go back to the public, but you just said you just have one word.
He never has.
Okay,
never
a sentence.
Never has just one word.
Just trying to keep him in place.
Frank knows me too well. So just one more thing, because you said global coup, and I addressed coup, but global, actually, one thing on this. It's really interesting if you look at all of these movements going on at the moment, climate, social justice, or whatever it is. They're not coming out of anywhere. They're not even coming out of necessarily the West. They're coming out of historically Protestant countries, if you look at it. And it's not coming out of the Catholic world or the Orthodox world or the Islamic world or the or South Asia or the Confucian cultures. It's coming out of the Protestant cultures. Max Weber said that the greatest legacy of Protestantism was secularism. And within a secular culture, and I disagree with Frank on this, I think, because it's always dangerous here. But
it's a free country.
But I disagree, and you said it's not religious because it's routinized and institutionalized. Well, whenever I went to church, it was pretty routine, it was pretty institutional. So I don't think those are the opposites. But I do think that if you look at the climate movement, it looks very, in its structure and its morality, it's very Protestant. I don't really know what Greta Thunberg's background is, but I don't think it's much coincidence that she's a Swede. You know, it's these countries with strong Protestant heritages that are producing this sort of millenarian fervor. And this is anyway, so I think there is, the difficulty with the secular world we live in is people who are secular in the West don't understand their morality and their structure of thinking is still very Christian, whether they go to church or not. Tom Holland's written about this in Dominion.
Let's see if the public agrees, if there are any more comments or questions. Yes, here there's a lady there, Philip. Yeah. And then the gentleman next to the lady afterwards.
Thank you very much. I think we mentioned a couple of times the IPCC report, and my understanding is that at least partially it is based on the NOAA data, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the US. And this is public data. I downloaded the Dallas International Airport data, and I figured that Dallas temperature for 100 years, almost 100 years periods, it was between 40 degrees Celsius and -10. And starting from 1976, I can see that it starts getting closer during the summer peak times to the 40 degrees. And not more frequently, but the same frequency, it picks up 2-3 degrees higher than it used to be. Now, if we think about that, probably the mid-70s, the traffic volume at the airport is started to grow exponentially. And also from 1992, we changed the engines. I think it's kind of logical that the temperature data, what we measure at the same place for 100 years, it will start grow naturally. And I also think that the NOAA data is similarly biased in many other sites, so much so that they actually accepted that they use an algorithm to get rid of this bias. So my question is, how do we make sure that the data we are using and policies based on it is accurate? Because the way how I see it, it's many, many places, they don't even have the sensor anymore because they can't hire people who will replace them. And they use an estimate which covers 130 miles area, which is very big, and they use it as an average. So I think it basically pushes up the temperature values quite significantly, and the growing temperature, the warming is not even there where we are saying. So question is how we can make sure that the used data is accurate and it is where it is.
Professor?
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is a real difficulty, but it also involves another difficulty. If you plot the data points, which is what you're talking about, they're scattered over plus or minus 10 degrees densely. If you plot the points, it just fills every point. The mean in that looks like 0. We then throw away the data points and stretch the scale by a factor of 10 so that 0 to 1 occupies the same place as before, -10 to 10, +10 occupied. We then say that's climate. What it's telling you is what you're calling climate is doing nothing significant. Instead, we're making believe it's the whole issue. Then people come in and say, well, the data points were taken in a sloppy way. And that's true. But that ended up, they told you the truth, that the residue of averaging them was almost nothing. Then you get ordinary people here to look at it and argue, did it go up 1 degree? Did it go up 0.7 degrees? Was 1.1 a record breaker? And these are meaningless discussions. And it's sort of tempting you to argue about that and forget about the fact that what they're talking about is meaningless.
Thank you. Any more questions? Here, the gentleman. Thank you.
I'm what they call, what Mr. Nicholson told, art scientist, mathematician, and computer expert in all times. I want to make a statement about exact science. As a mathematician, I can tell you that mathematics is not as such an exact science because it's based on a number of postulates. Euclides, in the geometry, in the old times, most of you have seen that, he had 5 postulates. Hilbert needed 20. And to get everything, you need postulates and degree. There's not only one mathematics. There's the Hilbert mathematics, there's intuitionism. That's complementary. Fractal mathematics doesn't fit in the old system because they don't talk about a number of 1, 2, 3 dimensions, but fractional dimensions. The same on logic. There's no exact logic as such. There's binary logic, there's 3-way logic. So even in exact science, we have assumptions. If you go on climate science, it's less valid. Of course, experience is important. The results are important. That's what Einstein did with Newton, etc. But exact science as such doesn't exist. This exact logic based on hypothesis. And I think that's the basic of science today, and one science is more exact in its conclusions than the other one. Thank you.
Thank you. Here, Tony, you have a question?
Yeah, please, thanks. 2 questions. One, in the early, or so I think late 70s, early 80s, this is not just specifically for Richard, but you'll know, I think there was some climate scientists like, for example, Stephen Schneider, James Hansen, who basically got involved in promoting their work very early on to the media. In other words, they went from doing their scientific study to saying, hey, this problem is so, in our opinion, so significant, we've got to get it out to the media. We've got to start almost, if you like, campaigning. So a certain number of scientists became quite like activists in the way in which they were operating. If you then go forward to the sort of late 90s and early noughties, you've got bodies like the Royal Society in the United Kingdom, very, very eminent overview scientific body, both in the country but also internationally, who have dedicated staff within that organization to do press releases, to frame research, to organize conferences, all targeted at changing the coverage that the media provide, influencing what politicians are doing. So you've got now scientific bodies acting like, if you like, campaign groups or NGOs. So why does that come about? What's behind that? What's the scope for countering it? And then more briefly, I thought Richard raised a really interesting point about the common sense of ordinary people and how you were saying educated people who feel embarrassed by their lack of scientific knowledge are unthinking in their acceptance of a lot of this stuff. And ordinary people, perhaps more willing to dig in or to think about it or question it and be a bit skeptical in the way that Frank was talking about. Yet it's still the case that this issue would seem to be quite a complex and tricky one. So how do we take that, if you like, more commonsensical skepticism and have a discussion about how we should respond to this issue without getting bogged down in the science? Is it possible to do this in a different way?
I think the answer is yes. And that's why I often point to cases where the basic science isn't at issue, but arithmetic is at issue. I'm willing to go to some extent in the hope that even educated people can do arithmetic. And so, for instance, with the culling of cattle and the control of methane, there was nothing very sophisticated involved in criticizing it. It was simply a matter that the amount of methane emitted, even if each molecule was, quote, more effective, is so much less than the amount of CO2 being emitted that its effect would be only a 10th or a 13th or a 20th of what CO2 would do. And so getting rid of all the cattle and all the source of methane from natural gas and so on would have an unmeasurable effect on climate. Why pick on them? That has nothing to do with the basic science. It's simply the numbers the scientists have presented, if you do a simple calculation, are telling you don't bother with the methane, don't bother with the N2O. The only thing you have to bother with, if you believe the scenario, is CO2. but the desire to control things, and in a funny way, punish people for eating meat, seems to overwhelm any wish to use arithmetic.
But then if you could, sorry, just very, very quickly, if you got a lot of scientists in cahoots, right, a lot of scientists with well-meaning, you know, thinking they're doing the right thing, passionate about the importance of the future, the importance of the next generation, etc. There's a lot of scientists and a lot of scientific bodies that are fully into promoting these things which you regard as minor, and I think are probably minor. So how do you reframe the debate? How do you have an intelligent discussion with people about the choices that they can make when so much of the scientific bodies, at least, if not the scientists themselves, are in cahoots with the whole narrative that you are arguing against?
You're asking a very difficult question in a way, but it is answerable. Yes, you're right. I mean, for instance, in the National Academy in the US, National Academy of Science, the current president is a woman named Marcia McNutt. Marcia earned this position by being editor of Science magazine and publicly publishing a statement that she would never publish anything that criticized the global warming hypothesis. That's a remarkable thing for someone who's editing a science magazine, and that it should furthermore be the thing that got her president of the National Academy. So we're in a very peculiar state for science. With respect to the Royal Society, there are any number of people there who I have great respect for. But I realized that, for instance, with one of them having dinner, and he was in a rage against Tony Blair not being far enough left, that there were other things influencing him than the science per se. And I think that's taken over for a lot of these people. The whole idea, as you say, of setting up public relations and other things and interactions go well beyond, for instance, the charter of the American National Academy of Sciences said you respond when called upon. From the very beginning, when it was established by Grant, the idea was they don't take the initiative. They're there to answer the questions of the lawmakers.
Yeah.
That's changed.
Thank you. Yes.
So I think that you cannot reframe the discussion, because the minute you try reframing the discussion, you enter into their premise. You kind of accept their starting point. And once you're on their terrain, then you're going to struggle to make any sense. I think the way forward is to basically take the initiative and indicate what we think are the important issues facing society. In other words, we've got to indicate that the really important issues facing society, Europe in particular, is the cost of living issues, a wide range of cost of living issues, which is what people are talking about. When you actually look at all the surveys that have been carried out as to which issues people really worry about, which issues they fear, it's never the ones that dominate the media. It's not global warming, it's not global terrorism, it's not COVID, it's not none of these things. You know, time and time again in every European country, it's things to do with my old age pension, is my child going to have a job when they become old, it's, you know, why aren't we having enough resources to make our ends meet? These are the kind of issues that are really quite important. And it seems to me that we've got to basically say that in our world, the year that we're living in, we've got to make sure that society is able to provide the resources necessary that human beings need to flourish. That's what we've got to begin with. And after we dealt with those kinds of issues, then it's possible to talk about what one of my colleagues calls luxury beliefs. Because I think global warming and the environmental movement are typical luxury beliefs, rather than the ones that are of necessity for society. So don't reframe their argument. You know, make sure that we frame our argument in a way that is compelling and relates and resonates with the beliefs of everyday people in society.
Thank you. Can I just mention that, yes, Calum, you can be next, but let's move on to your final remarks. So, Calum, if you will be first,
Well,
then
Anthony, go.
yeah, Anthony, then you, then Professor and Professor.
Right, my
Furedi.
last word.
Yes, we just have a few minutes left.
Yeah, I won't be a few minutes. I'm actually quite pessimistic because I think that Kuhn's description of the scientific world, I won't call it the scientific community, is by and large correct. And it's not just the scientific world, it's the world that I have lived in philosophy. These areas of thought, I'm afraid, tend to be dominated by what Kuhn calls paradigms. And this is not just an intellectual thing, this is a sociological thing that means that people who disagree are crowded out, they're not published, they don't get promoted. And we've seen lots of examples from that in the in the discussion so far. I mean, Richard's given us quite a few cases where there are actual examples of the scientific world being pushed in a certain direction, and people who disagree and who might say, well, a lot of the global warming is not anthropogenic, they will not get published, even though they probably have as good evidence as anybody else. So I think that what's needed is some decent education, and I mean decent education and not being led by people who refuse to go to school, some decent education in science, in the philosophy of science. I am a Popperian, and I actually think that it's not just in global warming that science is dominated by a paradigm. Just look at quantum theory. Quantum theory has been around for over 100 years, and the problems it started with have still not been solved. And of course, for Einstein, that was a disgrace. And indeed, Popper rather memorably once said, shall I say it in the way he spoke, something is rotten in the state of Denmark.
Thank you.
Why,
Shall we move on?
but I'm just going to say one other thing. What I think we must fight very strongly against, where we have the power, is the way that children in school are being indoctrinated and frightened by this stuff. And I think that is a crime.
Thank you.
So just my final comment is actually just want to pivot off something Frank said about the luxury beliefs, is that, you know, when I've looked at the loosely termed the political left, what I see is sort of what I've termed ideological gentrification. It's been taken over by middle class concerns, and I think the point Frank makes is right about climate, that, you know, that we should be concerned about, you know, you can be concerned about climate or not, but certainly all things in proportion, and we have there's many things that make up our lives. By analogy to this, you know, in the UK we've had the COVID inquiry. I'm not sure if it's over now, but they were doing this COVID inquiry of how the pandemic was handled. But there was never any discussion in the inquiry as whether they got the balance right of a consideration of COVID and everything else in our lives, education, work, other diseases. It was all about just dealing with COVID, very myopically. But the truth is our lives are complicated, and anyone's life involves a series of compromises, and it's the same for society. And I just feel that what we're losing sometimes in society is this sort of humility to recognize there are no perfect answers, there is no perfect society. We need to muddle through without doing too much violence to one thing or another by finding perhaps a slightly unhappy compromise. And I do think that's what's often lacking in the climate discussion. I think we need to, as Frank says, consider a lot of these other contextual elements about human life, the economy, livelihoods, education, and so on. And I think in terms of talking about beyond the consensus with this conference, for me, the point is to say, whether you like the science or not, my simple point is, even if you accept the science, for the sake of argument, all the most interesting and difficult questions remain untouched. And we don't just have the opportunity, but I think the duty to debate those openly in good faith without people being slandered one way or libeled one way or the other, called a denier or a naive activist or whatever it is. And you know, we just went through a pandemic. I do think one pandemic we have at the moment is of hubris on all sides of these debates, because everyone believes they are absolutely right, and by definition everyone else must be wrong. But the truth is, we probably just need to live with each other anyway, and it involves having good faith debates. And on this issue, I feel there's very little scope for that, and I hope this conference has opened up some questions that we can debate. Whether we find answers or not, at least we can discuss the questions civilly.
Thank you. Professor?
Yeah, I think you have to be a little bit worried. I mean, the reason existential threat came up, whatever its Protestant origins may be, was to get around exactly what you're calling for. It's saying if it's an existential threat, then considering anything else is inappropriate. And that's the purpose of saying it's an existential threat. So, you know, you're in a way speaking to people who've rejected what you're proposing.
Thank you. Frank?
Yeah, can I say that if people have time, they should look at my book, How Fear Works, because that deals with this. But if I'm wrong, I'm very old and my memory is really bad, but I think we were on a TV program once together on Channel 4 in Britain.
Oh, yeah, long ago.
I don't know when that was, but I remember I arrived there and there was because we made a movie. I didn't make the movie, but this guy made a movie, and they said they wanted to discuss the movie on the environment. And it turned into an auto-da-fe because they had about 4 or 5 environmentalists all lined up to basically denounce us. It was really like the Spanish Inquisition. And you know, one of them called me a communist, the other one suggested I was a fascist. And it was my first experience in the debate. I mean, it was surreal. It was like being in Kafka's castle, the whole thing. And I just remember that. I said to myself, I used a swear word, so I'm not going to say here, that if this is the way the discussion is going to go, we're in serious trouble. And I just want to say one thing, which is, contrary to what Anthony says, we mustn't be pessimistic. Because I think at the end of the day, the struggle for ideas, the struggle for truth, is one that always means that there's no such thing as a hopeless cause. It also means that at the end of the day, common sense, if you basically are, if you refuse to be cancelled, if you refuse to play the role that's assigned to you, if you refuse to be put into a corner, you know, under those circumstances, you know, at some point in time, common sense will connect with the aspirations of ordinary people. And we're already seeing a major pushback in Europe against many of these climate policies. And I think that demonstrates to me that there is a potential audience for the sort of, the kind of views that most of us have. We don't agree with everything, and we're not like a Leninist party where everybody has got the same views. But by and large, commonsensical views on this issue does have a resonance in European societies. I think we should be harder on ourselves. We've got to get our act together, get our arguments to be clearer and more focused. And if we don't succeed, don't blame them. Blame ourselves of not being good enough.
Thank you. Big round of applause for our speakers and for the friction. Oh, I'm sorry. I was so